Hello. Today I want to talk about scripture with regard to human inspiration, divine inspiration, and cultural context. In the second book of Timothy, chapter 3, verse 16, it says, "All scripture is God-breathed." This is often used as a proof text to prove the divine inspiration of the Bible. But if we look historically, we realize that this is actually inaccurate, because at the time of the writing of 2 Timothy, the New Testament hadn't yet been collated or put into its current form. Many of the books had not even been written at that point. However, I do believe that we can still apply that proof to the divine inspiration of Scripture to all of the books of the Bible, but we need to apply it through our reason and our understanding of church history, and looking at the way that all the scriptures were brought together to come to that conclusion. We'd also want to say that the Bible is humanly inspired. It was written by human beings in a particular context at a particular time. We know who some of them are, and we don't know who others are. And just in the same way that we would see Jesus as being both divine and human, we can say that Scripture is authored both divinely and humanly. And by analogy, when we talk about Jesus being human, we see him as being human in a particular cultural and historical context. And in the same way, I think we can talk about Scripture being located in a particular, specific cultural context. And I wonder what that means when we approach reading the Bible. How do we apply that? How do we listen to particular translators and commentators who help us to understand Scripture from a particular cultural location? So I'd like to suggest that we do need to apply our knowledge of culture and also our reason and also our tradition and experience when we read a passage from the Bible. What this does mean, though, is that it brings in the possibility of different interpretations of texts in the Bible, because by definition, each of us will have our own unique context and reason and tradition and experience. But it's cultural context that I want to particularly think about now, and to compare first century cultural context to 21st century cultural context. There were some things in the first century that were normative then that are no longer normative now. For example, slavery. Modern culture will now say that slavery is no longer an appropriate way to live and conduct society. But I wonder why it is, or how it is, that we have got to the point where society has said that slavery is wrong. If you know your history, you will know that there are individuals such as William Wilberforce who campaigned tirelessly for the abolition of slavery. But in order for slavery to be stopped, there needed to be a sense of general consensus amongst the wider population in a democratic parliamentarian system. And so when we read a passage in the Bible which talks about slavery, we need to be able to transpose that from first century culture into 21st century culture. And that may mean that we need to readjust our understanding of what the Scripture is saying to us now, as opposed to what it said in its original form. I also wonder whether we need to consider how change happens within a general consensus view, and whether, if the general consensus is for change, that is always right. I think we need to remember situations such as 1930s Germany to realise that just because there was a general consensus, it doesn't necessarily mean it is right. However, I do think that we need to wonder and ask questions about other societal changes, some of which are already happening around us, and whether we need to apply some cultural transposition with regard to equality and equity and diversity, and whether we need to consider the churches and our attitude toward the role of women in society and church, or even same-sex relationships. All of these questions are difficult and yet I think important for us to consider as we seek to read the Bible faithfully.